This episode was suggested by Tara and Matthew on Facebook and Sarah on Patreon. If you'd like to suggest a topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast, on Twitter at Morbid Podcast, and on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you'd like to become a patron of the MCP, go to bit.ly/morbidpatron. That's bit.ly/morbidpatron, and you can support us for as little as $1 an episode. This episode is the second part of a two-part episode about Sir John Franklin's lost expedition. To make sure you get the full story, we recommend you start with part 1, but there is a short summary at the beginning of this second part of the episode. The MCP will be taking a break at the beginning of January, but we'll be back after that with more morbid curiosities. This is our last regular episode of 2019. We'll be posting a holiday horror story reading on December 24th for the entire creepy community to celebrate the end of the year, and an Ask Me Anything episode on Patreon during the first part of January. So if you'd like to hear the AMA episode, you can join Patreon at the $1 level for January. We can't wait to see you all again in 2020. And now, with all the announcements done, on with the episode. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so, the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. In Part 1, we talked about Britain's search for the Northwest Passage, a then theoretical sea route to Asia that traverses from the Atlantic to the Pacific through the Canadian Arctic Archipelago. Finding a route through the maze of islands and ice was dangerous, involving issues like freezing temperatures, getting stuck in the floating pack ice, dealing with malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies, and limited food supply. Many people had tried before Sir John Franklin set out in 1845 for what he hoped would be the expedition that finally mapped and successfully traversed the Northwest Passage. For his expedition, Franklin took 2 ships, the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror, both reinforced bomb ships fitted with steam heat systems and loaded with tinned food, lemon juice to stave off scurvy, a vitamin C deficiency that causes weakness and lethargy in its early stages, and bleeding, rotting gums, internal hemorrhaging, and death in its later stages, scientific equipment, and 129 men in woolen coats and gloves. The ships were last spotted headed west through Lancaster Sound, the most eastern entrance to the Northwest Passage, on July 12, 1845. I'll be posting several maps after this episode goes live so that you can see Franklin's route and where all the artifacts I'm going to mention were found. When the expedition didn't return in the estimated 3 years, other Arctic explorers were sent to find them, and none were successful. In fact, John Clark Ross's expedition was nearly lost itself in 1849, both due to the cold and a mysterious illness that broke out amongst his crew, with symptoms that included sluggishness, anxiety, and melancholy. After John Clark Ross's expedition failed, a £20,000 reward, about £2.6 million in today's currency, was offered by the British government to anyone who could find or assist Franklin's expedition in 1850. In total, the British Admiralty sent 8 ships back to the Arctic in search for Franklin, some going east from the Bering Strait, and some west from Baffin Bay. Lady Jane Franklin, Sir John's wife, went to Baffin Bay herself to look for him and asked the United States government for aid. They sent 2 ships, and the Hudson Bay Company, a fur trading group out of Canada, sent John Ray, an Arctic survival expert. It was John Ray who found 2 small pieces of wood on the southern shore of Victoria Island, a place where no trees grow, but he had no way to prove that they might have come from the Terror or Erebus. He would have continued his search by crossing over to King William Island, but floating pack ice blocked his path. In August of 1850, Captain Erasmus Omani found fragments of preserved meat tins, ragged clothing, and British naval stores at Cape Riley on the southwest coast of Devon Island. These indicated that Franklin had made a short stop on shore, but when Omani continued to search, he came upon a cairn on Beechey Island. The crew of his rescue team quickly made their way to it and took it apart, searching for evidence of Franklin, but none was found. More ships soon convened on that area, and more traces of Franklin's expedition were found at Cape Spencer, also on Devon Island, a hut built of stones, a scrap of paper that bore the words "Until Called," more food tins, and a pair of torn gloves. On the 27th of August, Captain William Penny, a Scottish whaler and Arctic explorer in command of the ship Lady Franklin, discovered 3 graves on Beechey Island, facing Cape Riley. The graves lay side by side, 2 neatly carved with inscriptions that told who lay beneath the frozen ground. One was William Brain of the HMS Erebus, who died on April 3, 1846. The other was John Hartnell, also of the Erebus, who died January 4, 1846. The third grave marker was not as carefully done and was the earliest of the 3 deaths on January 1, 1846. It belonged to John Torrington of the HMS Terror. Although deaths were expected on such an expedition, 3 in one winter was a bad sign. Captain Penny believed the site must have been where Franklin's crew had stayed over their first winter in 1846. Penny's party kept searching the island and found traces of tents, a forge, a storehouse, and other small structures. There was even what appeared to be a small garden, with anemones still growing inside it. Another cairn was discovered soon after, made of over 600 empty food tins stacked 7 feet high, or 2.1 meters. However, there was no message found inside it, which was unusual, as cairns were usually placed to share information with other explorers. So far, Franklin's trail went from Baffin Bay, where he was last seen, to Beechey Island, and then was lost. The search parties were perplexed. They had found something, and yet nothing at all. No indication of where Franklin's expedition had gone, what had happened, or how they had come to be there. The 3 deaths of Franklin's crew were initially blamed on inferior quality tinned food. Captain Omani suggested it had spoiled, and that the supplier, Goldner, had provided badly sealed tins for other expeditions that had putrefied quickly and caused botulism, a fatal illness caused by a toxin that's produced by a bacteria which grows in improperly canned food. This sparked an inquiry into Goldner, but the audit found that the tinned food provided for previous expeditions had been fine. Medical professionals of the time theorized that scurvy had likely caused the deaths, or perhaps an unlucky number of accidents. Omani's expedition did not exhume the bodies to examine them, however. In August of 1852, more ships set out for Beechey Island. However, the searchers from 1850 had moved and turned over the site so much that it was hard to discover anything more. Despite the media attention surrounding Franklin's disappearance and the dangers of the Arctic, the search sparked another era of Arctic exploration. Over 30 water and overland expeditions sought evidence of Franklin's lost expedition over the next 20 years and resulted in charting much of the Canadian Arctic Archipelago and mapping the full route of the Northwest Passage. However, the passage wasn't successfully navigated by sea until 1906. Sailors readily volunteered for these search missions, but many of the expeditions were cut short due to illness aboard the ships, running out of supplies, and the dangers of becoming trapped in pack ice. Captain George Henry Richards reported general debility or weakness among his crew, and Sir Edward Belcher had to abandon 4 of his 5 vessels to escape the Arctic after 2 years stuck in the ice. Mental illness was also an issue. Captain Richard Collinson ended up placing many of his officers under arrest, saying scurvy had affected their minds. Captain Robert McClure reported that after becoming trapped in the ice, several of his men went mad. His ships had carried lime juice and collected greens to stave off scurvy for the first 2 winters they had spent in the Arctic, but during the third, they ran out. This was the beginning of the realization that the tinned food did not prevent scurvy as previously thought. 2 American expeditions suffered extensively from disease during their search. In 1850, an expedition funded by Henry Grinnell went out in May. The conditions on the ships, the Advance and the Rescue, were cramped, damp, and cold, and illness quickly became widespread. The symptoms again included melancholy and a new symptom, a craving for animal fat. The men reported vivid dreams, had pale skin, pain in old wounds, and stiff limbs. When they were able to hunt seals and walrus in the short summers, the illness cleared up quickly, which is evidence that it was indeed scurvy. However, as soon as winter hit again, so did scurvy. Over the 2 expeditions sponsored by Grinnell, there was a mutiny. Rats were eaten as a last resort, and many men died. In the spring of 1855, thanks to the return of game and aid given by the Inuit people, the expedition was able to abandon what was left of the Advance, as they had used much of its wood for firewood, and head south. They were picked up by a Danish ship after 84 days. In January of 1854, Franklin's expedition had been missing for 9 years. The members of the expedition were officially declared dead on March 31st. People were still interested in searching for them, however. In October of 1854, John Ray announced the first major discovery in the case. He had spoken to the Inuit people of the area around the Boothia Peninsula, which is quite far south of Beechey Island. A man named Inuk Pu Jejuk reported that a party of white men had starved to death after their ship was crushed against the ice. The white men had dragged sledges down the western coast of King William Island after abandoning the ships. The Inuit people also said that it appeared the men had been eating each other for sustenance. They also described books, tinned food, and other items known to have been carried with Franklin's expedition. John Ray himself came across a corpse that he described as mutilated by what could only have been cannibalism. However, because John Ray's information came secondhand and from a non-white source, it was judged as inconclusive. The British public refused to believe that Franklin's men would resort to cannibalism, even for survival. But the artifacts the Inuit people gave him were clear evidence that the expedition had perished. One more attempt was made before the search was abandoned. The British Admiralty sent James Anderson, who discovered a piece of wood with the name Terror branded on it, on Montreal Island, which is southeast of King William Island. He also found several food tins, but nothing more. Now distracted by the Crimean War, the British government turned its attention away from the search. Lady Franklin, however, continued to rally support for a final in-depth search. She knew she wouldn't find her husband alive, but she wanted to restore his good name, as the British press had begun insinuating that his failure was due to incompetence. Even though she knew he was most likely dead, she had to know his fate. She became an expert on Arctic geography by searching all the maps that had resulted from previous searches. Eventually, with her own money and help from the public, she funded a search in 1857, commanded by Captain Francis Leopold McClintock, a Royal Navy officer, on the ship the Fox. The Fox set sail on July 1st, 1857. It was trapped in the ice of Baffin Bay the first winter. By August 1858, the Fox had reached Beechey Island. McClintock erected a monument at the site of Franklin's first winter quarters. The Fox then spent a second winter at the eastern opening of the Bellot Strait, just west of Baffin Island. From that base, they sent overland expeditions to King William Island in April of 1859. McClintock spoke to 2 families of Inuit people who showed him artifacts from Franklin's expedition. They told him that the Erebus and Terror had been seen, but that one of the ships had sunk in deep water, and the other forced ashore. They also said the white men from the ships had gone toward the Great River, and when the Inuit people went there the next winter, they found only bones. McClintock and his second-in-command, Lieutenant W.R. Hobson, searched the southern and western coast of King William Island. What they discovered was confirmation that Franklin and his expedition had met a very grim end indeed. But before we get to that, let's pause for a word from our sponsors. Our regular sponsor is Audible.com. Audible can provide you with interesting and engaging audiobooks. In fact, there are over 180,000 of them to choose from, which you can listen to on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 players. MCP listeners can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial of Audible.com by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. You can also find this link on our Facebook page and website. If you sign up for the free trial, you get a free audiobook that is yours to keep, even if you cancel the service as soon as you finish downloading it. And the MCP gets the funding it needs to keep bringing morbid history to your ears. So go get your free audiobook on us. Lastly, if you like this podcast, why not sponsor the MCP yourself by becoming a patron on Patreon? Over 30,000 people download this podcast every month, but only around 90 people are supporting us on Patreon. For a mere $1 an episode, that's $2 a month, you can get ad-free episodes, bonus behind-the-scenes info, give your opinion by answering polls, help choose episodes, and get updates on past episodes. For $3 an episode, you get monthly outtake reels. For $5, you get a monthly quiz episode where I quiz my husband on past episodes. For $10, you get a detailed bibliography of all the resources I used while researching each topic. And for $20, you get a bit of miscellaneous morbidity, a short essay on a random morbid topic every month. Previously, we've reviewed horror video games, discussed the medicine of Westeros, and the plague pits of London. All of these rewards aside, your patronage supports the podcast and keeps new episodes coming. I can't keep doing this podcast without you, so go to bit.ly/morbidpatron, that's bit.ly/morbidpatron, to choose your rewards and support the MCP. You'll have my eternal gratitude. And now, back to the podcast. On the 5th of May, 1859, a cairn was discovered at Victory Point. Inside, a metal canister was found, containing a scrap of naval record paper. On the margins of the form, 2 short messages were scrawled. One was written by Lieutenant Graham Gore and gave the progress of the Franklin expedition up until May 1847, stating that they had wintered in the ice near Beechey Island in 1947-48. Ascended the Wellington Channel, and returned along the west side of Cornwallis Island. All was well. He also wrote that a party of 2 officers and 6 men had left the ships on the 24th of May. The year recorded by Gore for wintering at Beechey Island, however, was wrong, as it had been 1845 that they had done so. But the note reported that all was well, at least up until it was written. It appeared that this first message had been written and then put in a metal canister and then stored in the cairn. 11 months later, it had been retrieved, and the second note was written by Captain James Fitzjames, Sir John Franklin's first officer aboard the HMS Erebus. This second note told exactly what had befallen the expedition. The Terror and the Erebus had been abandoned on April 22, 1847, after being trapped in the ice near the northwest coast of King William Island since September 12th. 105 of the crew were left, and under the command of Commander Crozier, Franklin's second-in-command. Sir John Franklin had died on June 11th of 1847. The remaining members of the expedition planned to head for Back's Fish River, south of Montreal Island on the mainland. It seemed the expedition had taken a turn for the worst over that 11-month period. The ship should have been able to break free of the ice in the short summer in 1847, but they hadn't been able to. They remained stuck for a second winter just off King William Island. 24 crew members, including Franklin, had died. The rest deserted the ships and set up camp on the northwest coast of the island, hoping to journey south to the Back River, and then likely on to Fort Resolution, a Hudson Bay Company outpost around 1,250 miles or 2,210 kilometers away. The cairn where the note was found was surrounded by clothing and items like boats, pickaxes, shovels, and cooking stoves, which appeared to have been dropped in an effort to take only the necessities with them for their trek south. McClintock wondered why they had brought many of the items in the first place. The futility of their plight was now laid bare. They must have known there was no way a group of already exhausted and disease-riddled people could make it that far overland in the Arctic. Around 80 miles into this trek south, down the western coast of King William Island, McClintock found what appeared to be a field hospital. Hobson found a lifeboat containing 2 skeletons, one having been torn up by animals, but both holding guns, as if they planned to defend themselves from something. McClintock named the area Cape Crozier and wondered why the crew had wasted their limited energy dragging a fully equipped boat weighing around 1,400 pounds or 635 kilograms along with them. The boat was also pointing back toward the abandoned ships, not toward their stated destination. This location, which McClintock called the boat place, was not recorded, and modern researchers have been trying to locate it ever since. More on that later. On May 24, 1859, McClintock and his search party discovered a human skeleton on a ridge of the southern shore of King William Island. It wore a steward's uniform known to have been worn on Franklin's expedition. It appeared the man had fallen as he walked. Nearby they found a notebook with the name Harry Pegler inside, a member of the Terror crew. Half of the notes were written by Pegler, and the other half were written by a different, unknown person. The unknown writer wrote about the disaster that befell the expedition. However, the notes were very strange. The words were spelled backwards and ended in capital letters. Once translated, they described graves being dug and mentioned dates that could refer to the night the crew abandoned the ships. There was also a drawing of an eye with the words Lid Bay written under it, and a page where the words had been written in a circle, and at the center was written, "The Terror Camp Clear." McClintock and Hobson's discoveries were thought of as admirable back in England, and brought Lady Franklin the knowledge she sought. Franklin's reputation was redeemed. He had died performing his duty and in pursuit of the Northwest Passage. Despite obtaining the knowledge of what happened, people continued to search for more information, more artifacts, and more human remains from the Franklin expedition. In 1859, Charles Francis Hall, an American from Ohio, set out to discover if perhaps some of the members of the expedition might have survived by living amongst the Inuit people of the area. After finding nothing, he went back in 1864 and 1869. He spoke to many Inuit people and recorded their knowledge of the expedition. Again, cannibalism was mentioned, and that the Inuit people had tried to assist the starving men, but that the winter was so difficult that it was too risky to help the men without endangering themselves. The Inuit people also reported that Franklin's crew seemed very sick. In 1849, a group of Inuit people had found one of the ships still stuck in the ice. They had taken what supplies were available and noted a very large frozen body of a man inside a locked room. They said he had a blackened mouth, which could indicate bloody gums, a characteristic sign of scurvy. They left him where he sat and said the ship sank not long after that. In June 1878, another American, Lieutenant Frederick Schwatka, led a small expedition to King William Island that followed the retreat route of Franklin's crew by sledge. He located the boat place mentioned by McClintock and found it heavily looted, but many non-food items still remained, including the bones of 4 men scattered around the boat. Please remember that there was little in the way of food or hunting in this area of the world. The living people in the area had to take what they could to survive, or they would starve. Schwatka also found a disturbed grave, likely belonging to John Irving, as a medal with his name on it was found there. Because of the presence of an actual coffin or burial shroud, it's thought that this grave had been dug while the crew still lived aboard the ships. However, as the grave had been disturbed, Schwatka gathered the bones scattered around it and brought them to England for burial. While he was in the Arctic, Schwatka also spoke to the Inuit people and heard more stories of Franklin's men and their ship. They were described as sickly and their mouths blackened. Some of them made it to Simpson Strait, to an area Schwatka named Starvation Cove when he arrived there. It was said they carried with them a box of bones. Schwatka wondered if the bones belonged to Franklin. When he searched the area, he only found the bones of a single person. When he asked, the Inuit people told him that the sea and the land had taken the men. There have been many discoveries since Schwatka's expedition by many other researchers, far too many to go over even in a 2-part podcast. Over 400 artifacts have been recovered and are now on display at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, London. If you'd like more information, I'd recommend reading Frozen in Time, The Fate of the Franklin Expedition by John Geiger and Owen Beatty. Dr. Owen Beatty, an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Alberta, set out in the 1980s to search for more remnants of the Franklin expedition at King William Island. His survey was meticulous and used more modern forensic techniques. He wanted to find human remains from which he could glean information about health and diet, determine if it really was scurvy that had devastated the men, find out if they had really resorted to cannibalism, and perhaps identify them. He returned to the sites previously visited by McClintock, Hall, and Ray, and other 19th century searchers. Beatty and his team also worked with the Inuit people of the area, recorded their oral histories of the event, and tried to corroborate these stories with physical evidence. Some of the graves located by previous searchers turned out to be Inuit graves, but other sites really did belong to the Franklin expedition. Beatty and his team found the bones of a sailor at Booth Point at the most southern tip of King William Island. The skull was in fragments and scattered near a group of larger stones, possibly the site of a tent. The bones from the arms and legs were found more loosely scattered outside the circle of stones. With the help of Dr. James Savell, an Arctic archaeologist from McGill University, the first physical evidence of cannibalism among Franklin's starving crew was revealed. The bones were peppered with cut marks from a metal implement and were in locations that suggested dismemberment and defleshing. The heaviest and least portable portions of the body, those of the ribs, sternum, vertebrae, and hips, were missing. As I said earlier, when John Ray reported in 1854 that Franklin's men had resorted to cannibalism, many people didn't believe him. These bones were physical evidence that the Inuit people Ray spoke to were correct, and the bodies he described as being mutilated were indeed subjected to cannibalism. The bones found at the site also showed signs of severe malnutrition, including indications of scurvy. In 1984, the 3 graves of Franklin's men discovered previously on Beechy Island were located by Beatty and excavated, which was difficult as the ground was completely frozen. Images of the frozen corpses of John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain were soon published in magazines and newspapers all over the world. People were horrified but deeply fascinated. The men were still recognizable, and it felt as if they were staring straight at those who viewed them, looking out from the distant past. Beatty and his team performed autopsies on all 3 men and tested them for disease. William Brain tested positive for tuberculosis, but Beatty felt that tuberculosis didn't directly contribute to his death. All 3 men had granulomas in their lungs, which could have been caused by tuberculosis, pneumonia, or a variety of other lung infections. Beatty also found that the men had a very high content of lead in their systems, either ingested due to contamination from the lead seals on the tinned food, or from drinking the water that passed through the lead pipes on the ships. He proposed that scurvy, botulism from contaminated food, lead poisoning, and respiratory infections all may have contributed to the men's deaths. As for the lead poisoning theory, it has been shown by more recent studies that the lead levels of these 3 men were not above average for the 19th century. Scurvy, starvation, and illness likely contributed far more than lead poisoning. In 1992, a new site was discovered on King William Island, near Erebus Bay, with artifacts such as clay pipes and buttons that linked it to the Franklin expedition. Around 400 human bones and bone fragments were present, representing between 8 and 11 individuals. There were no graves, however, and the bones were mostly fragmentary and scattered over a 300 square meter area, concentrated on the western part of the site. The scatter was probably due to many years of animal activity as well as some human activity. The bones, which were mostly long bones from the limbs, but also some pelvic bones, showed signs of arthritis, tooth loss, tooth decay, and periostitis, which is an infection of the layer of tissue between the bone and muscles, and indicates infection or injury. When the bones were chemically tested, high levels of lead were noted. Cut marks from metal blades were also found on 92 of the bones, all in areas where muscles attach, which supports the claim of cannibalism. Several bones had also been shattered to get at the marrow. It's not known how soon after death this occurred, but it wasn't very long after death. In 2008, then Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper announced a government-sponsored search for the HMS Erebus and Terror. In 2014, the wreck of the HMS Erebus was finally discovered by Parks Canada, thanks to around 10 years of studying Inuit oral histories and scanning the area with modern technology. Louis Kamukak, an Inuk historian, collected the stories of his people and met with archaeologists. Together they combined their research and were able to locate the wreck just north of O'Reilly Island, which is just southwest of King William Island. The ship was found in relatively shallow water, its deck sitting only 36 feet or 11 meters below the surface. It was well preserved except for an area of the stern, which was likely damaged by ice. If you recall the story told to Hall, several Inuit people boarded the Erebus soon after it was abandoned and saw a large man locked in a room aboard. Sadly, no body has yet been recovered, though some believe the body described by the Inuit people was that of Franklin. Others believe he was buried somewhere on shore in a marked location so that his body could be collected later and given a proper burial back in England. There's an excellent book just on the discovery of the Erebus called Franklin's Lost Ship, The Historic Discovery of the HMS Erebus by John Geiger and Alana Mitchell, if you're interested. It has some amazing pictures in it, which both show the modern technology used to find the ship and help illustrate just what Franklin and his crew were up against in the Arctic. I highly recommend it. In 2016, acting on information from Sami Kogvik, an Inuk hunter and Canadian Army serviceman, a joint expedition including the Royal Canadian Navy, the Canadian Coast Guard, and the Arctic Research Foundation discovered the wreck of the HMS Terror. Kogvik had seen a pole sticking up out of the water in Terror Bay, which is on the southern coast of King William Island. Research began earlier this year when Parks Canada sent several miniature ROVs, or remotely operated vehicles, down into the frigid water to inspect the ship, inside and out. The ship sits in 69 to 79 feet, or 21 to 24 meters of water, and it too is very well preserved. Glass still sits in many of the windows, and tins of food have been spotted inside the mess hall. Most of the ship is covered in kelp and other sea creatures, but it doesn't appear to be damaged in any way. The use of the anchor also suggests the men may have returned to the ship at some point after abandoning it. This new mystery is sure to unfold as research is published over the next few years, and I'm sure most of us will follow the story closely. Why are we fascinated with Franklin and his lost expedition? I agree with Margaret Atwood, who wrote the introduction to Beattie and Geiger's book. She states that there is something inconclusive, something upsetting about people that can't be found. There's no answer, no solution, no closure. Even though we know there is no way, frozen or not, that Franklin is alive today, we still want to know what happened to him, to know more about how he and his crew perished. His disappearance haunts us. The location where they were lost is also mysterious. Not many people have been there, and not many people live there today. It's empty, otherworldly, and beautiful, but also extremely deadly. It's a place that humans have yet to conquer completely. Many have tried, and many have never returned. A mysterious disappearance in a mysterious place is bound to spark our curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media, and please give us a rating on iTunes. Your shares and ratings help us reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who commented, suggested topics, shared MCP posts, liked or followed the MCP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and gave us ratings on iTunes. People like Amber, Alexander, Maria, Elena, Mary, Meredith, Silas, Barry, Ben, Kelsey, and Megan B. Kim, Keeley, Amber, and Lady Grey 3 all have my eternal gratitude for becoming patrons. Thank you so much. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing, especially on Facebook, so head over there to engage with other listeners, discuss episodes and news articles, and share your own creepy stories and cute pet pictures. The MCP is part of a wider creepy community known as the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. As I said before, if you really like the MCP, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can also give one-time donations by going to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com, and clicking the donate button. On our website, you can also find links to all our social media and sponsors, and other ways to contact us. If you'd rather contact us by mail, this address is also listed on the website. Another way to help the show is by going to our Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.